Okay, thanks. So I'm going to come back and talk about one of the things that's come out of this International Funders Workshop that we had in Amsterdam a few months ago. And it's called ADORE.software, and that's also the website. It's the Amsterdam Declaration on Funding Research Software Sustainability that we're trying to finalize and then trying to get people to sign up to and endorse and commit to. And so let me kind of talk about kind of what all of that means. When RISA formed initially, research software funding was an immediate topic that came up from all of the organizations that were involved. And the discussions that we had in the Funders Forum and more generally then led to this workshop that we had in Amsterdam. We had 45 funding organizations represented. We've defined funding to be not just those that are providing monetary support, but also those that are providing in-kind support, both to software and to people. And so it's a slightly looser definition of funder than just a financial one. We, in this workshop, had drafted an initial declaration in advance of the workshop, and then a lot of the workshop was really reacting to it, the funders reacting to it, saying what they liked, what they didn't like, what we missed, things like that. We have an internal team that has just published a next version that we're calling 0.3. This was published, I think, last week on Monday, I believe. And it's now available for consultation, and I'm going to just talk about some of the things that are in this declaration. So it starts with a preamble, and it kind of tries to set out a case of why we're actually raising this as an issue. And the case is basically that digitalization has really changed the way that research happens over the last somewhere between 10 and 50 years. Research software has become essential to research today. The sustainability of research software, as I was mentioning before, is essential to address. And that this question about research software and its sustainability contributes to the larger discussion of research culture, which I think most people recognize is also in the process of changing and probably needs to change further. Funders have a critical role to play in this process in changing culture and in sustaining research software. And then last is the fact that the research software ecosystem is global, but most funders are not global. And so because of that, there's coordination that's needed in order to effectively influence the ecosystem. We've set out 12 recommendations in this draft in 4 different areas, the first being in research practice. And I guess I'll just talk through these very quickly, but the recommendations basically are that funders should stimulate effectively the production and accessibility of research software to enable the reproducibility of research outcomes. That funders should incentivize the reuse and improvement of existing software, and that funders should include research software as part of open science policies. In terms of the research software ecosystem itself, that funders should stimulate and develop the maintenance of a research software ecosystem. And that includes people and communities and infrastructure. That funders should be aware of each other's investment and work in a coordinated manner because the research software ecosystem exceeds institutional and national boundaries. And that funders should ensure that funding instruments are fit for purpose for both sustainability and innovation, so that research software is both maintained and developed for the longer term to have a healthy ecosystem. In terms of people, that funders should stimulate the training, hiring, and funding of professional research and technical staff who are able actually to do this work, to reuse, develop, and maintain sustainable software. That funders should consider the value and impact of research software as a research output in its own right, and facilitate appropriate reward and recognition mechanisms that enable career progression for all the people that are involved in this process. And that funders should require responsible citation practices for research software to recognize all the contributors. And then finally, in terms of ethics, that funders should encourage the responsible use of the appropriate indicators to assess the degree of permanence, reusability, and impact of the software. That funders should explicitly coordinate environmental and social impacts of the use of research software. And that funders should explicitly recognize that diversity, equity, and inclusivity are significant factors in making research software sustainable. So we have those 12 recommendations. We're then going to follow this up by a toolkit, and if you look in version 3 of the declaration, there's very little of this toolkit there. There may actually be almost none of it there. So this is the area that's really the thing that we need to work the most on in the next version. And the idea of what we're calling this toolkit is that it's intended to be explanations and definitions and examples, because the recommendations by themselves are fairly short. And for somebody that's not really embedded in the research software landscape, there may be questions about, I don't know, what is a funder? What is research software? Why does it need to be sustainable? Things like that. And so we want to kind of go into a lot of those things, explain and define things, explain the complexity of research software, including its dependency stack that really adds a lot of challenges here. Talk about the fact that there's different kinds of research software. There's some that's infrastructure, and there's some that is just used to solve a particular problem. To talk about the fact that some open source software is research software and some research software is open source software, but these are not identical, and they're both important. To talk about open science and how it relates to research software, to talk about FAIR and how it relates to research software, to talk about what reusability of research software means and how it's different but related to reproducibility, which also involves the use of research software. And then to talk about how to manage research software as a process, potentially including options for sunsetting, right? So that when you start funding something and you fund to sustain it, you don't fund it forever. You have to think about what's going to happen to it afterwards. So the website, as I mentioned before, is ADORE.software. We're now starting to gather different groups of people. So one is people that express an interest potentially in signing. And the idea is that signatories will endorse the adoption of the recommendations to improve the ecosystem and agree to share their organization's process towards adopting this over time. It's a moral commitment. It's not a legal commitment. So there's nothing binding about it other than that you've said publicly that you're going to do this. We're also interested in people that are just interested in following this process and maybe want to provide some general feedback, but their organization is likely not going to be a signer. Maybe they're a university or a publisher or somebody else that's in a different situation. And we're talking now about governance and whether RISA would lead the governance or the member organizations would lead the governance. We're kind of looking at Quora as an exemplar